Good morning. Um, let's see. Let us click. There we go. That's me. I wanted to talk a little bit about something at the edge of the network. So one of the great things about distributed cryptography is that within networks, it works pretty well. I work for an organization that works at the place where networks end. And I'm going to go very quickly through a bunch of slides, but I'm going to try to do a probably 30-minute talk in crypto time. So apologies for that. I come from the sort of tech startup world in emerging markets. I've been at UNICEF for a few years now. And UNICEF is a big organization that I didn't know very much about before I joined it. It's an organization with offices in 190 countries. It works directly with governments. And it works to basically push forward the rights of children and people who nobody else wants to fight for. And that's a very aspirational goal. But it's important to the world of cryptography for a set of reasons. One thing is that because of its huge market size, well, huge in the development space, not huge in the tech space, but as a $5.5 billion a year organization with access to governments, UNICEF has the ability to set agendas. And we do that, for example, in our purchases of vaccines, where we buy about a third of the world's vaccines and can therefore set market prices. But what does that mean for this type of conference? It also means that as we're looking at new technologies, we have the ability to be at the edge of what's coming and look and see how we can apply it to the problems that exist right now. So our team is very lucky to have made some early experimentations in the space of distributed ledgers, and particularly in looking at how we can use distributed cryptography to fix big problems. So that's the sort of overall framing of it. I'm going to go into a few examples of what those big problems are and where we see the potential business value for working against them. So this is our team. It's a bunch of nerds who come mostly from tech product design. And we tend to look at a set of problems that should concern everybody in this room. They certainly concern me. For example, problems like urbanization. We're in a place right now where housing is very expensive, but housing in cities is going to get even more expensive. By 2050, you're going to have 70% of people living in urban environments. And that's a big problem, because it's really hard to provide services to people in densely packed places, particularly to poor people. And I'll come back to that. We're also living in a world where people are on the move more than ever, and whether these are people without full documentation or people who've been displaced by war or violence, that means that the world has become more unstable. We've got about 60 million, this slide is 2 months old, so it's now 60 million kids who are displaced because of war or violence in their homes. And if you're displaced from your country, that means that you don't have the traditional formal systems to take care of you that you once did. Now, there's a notional inference here that links that to a distributed network. If you're no longer part of a formal network, you might be able to fall back on something else. Let's see. Here's some more depressing stuff. The planet is broken. There are about 400 million kids who either don't have enough food because there's too much water on their land or there's not enough. We've seen this in California over the last few years. This is not a problem just for places far away. But the fundamental change of the world means that we have to be much more quick to adapt to it. And traditional technologies, traditional frameworks of government don't move as quickly as the problems we're facing. This is all the depressing stuff. I promise the jokes come later. There's like 2 more depressing ones. Yay, robots. The problem with automation is that anybody who's thinking about it, but particularly I think what Jack Ma has been saying recently and what Kai-Fu Lee has been saying from China about the automated future is a future that leaves out a poor middle class almost entirely. And so it's a future that looks very good for a few people in the world and very, very dark for everybody else. And then finally, we're in a world that's much more connected than before. So we see a disease like Zika spread quickly across borders that would have been impermeable in a more traditional world. That's all the depressing stuff, I promise. Now, what does that mean when we're talking about blockchains? We believe that as we look towards a world that is increasingly digital, we have the capacity to fix some of those problems. There are more people on Facebook than there are people in China. There are more people on WeChat than there are people in India. And these companies have become countries. And we can admit it or not, and we can say it's sovereign plus or post-sovereign, but the types of services that a company provides, a platform provides to its users, are services that used to be provided by governments. If you're one of the Syrian kids traveling through Europe on your refugee trail, you're one of those 55 million, 60 million displaced kids, you don't have a state identity, but you do have an electronic identity, and that electronic identity is your WhatsApp number that you signed up for WhatsApp on in Damascus or in Aleppo, and you've carried that same number across 5 different countries with you because that links you to your friends and family. And that's important. You no longer have a ministry of education to take care of you, but you have this digital trace, and nobody said this is your identity. but it became your identity as you used it over and over, and as you started to write records in a ledger, and of course WhatsApp doesn't have that, but if we think about notionally where that goes, you can imagine a world where these post-sovereign countries become able to provide services to their citizens. And I'm going to just give 2 examples, maybe 3, of that. That's a cell tower. That's in contrast to all the depressing pictures. This is hopefully one of the less depressing ones, because as we look to connect the people who aren't connected, all of those problems that I talked about affect the most disconnected much more than anybody with an iPhone. So this is a country. You can tell it's a country because it has straight lines. Straight lines are not created by humans. I mean, by like natural humans. They're only created by humans in offices. Right? If you go hiking and you see a straight line, you can go towards that. That will save you if you're lost in the woods. So Sierra Leone was drawn by people far away a long time ago in its borders. And if I asked you where people in Sierra Leone were, and this is interesting because there's been a lot of discussion in the last 2 days about Sierra Leone's elections recently being transcribed on a blockchain, and there's a lot of disambiguation that needs to happen about what exactly went on there. But if I asked you where people are in Sierra Leone from this map, you would not be able to tell me, I don't think. If you could, you'd be amazing. If I looked at the data traces that come out of people's mobile network activity, you'd be able to see exactly where people are. So this is a picture of Sierra Leone as seen through cell phone data. And what you can see here are the different colored chunks are communities. These communities are created because you call somebody, you talk to them, you hang out with them, and that creates a record on a ledger. It's not a distributed ledger, it's owned by a phone company, but you kind of get the idea. So there's a purple group up in the right and that purple group on the left. That's actually a community. People live up there and they travel down there for work and they go back. It's a community that's not described by traditional methods, by traditional objects that the governments of old may be used to working with. But let me show you something else about that network. If you look at the left, that's Sierra Leone as seen in that's like a policy book, a guidance book. That's if the SEC is looking at a country, they divide it into states, right? Blah. That's there. If you look at ethnic things, that's what a university might teach you. That's also wrong. If you look at real-time data, that's a very different picture of a world. So what happens when we start seeing these communities? And I'm asking these as questions to sort of think about over the next day and a half, because it looks to us like those communities that are emerging are going to be the ones that are most in need of the technologies that we see coming up in the blockchain space. So what if you could focus on that community, that green community, and what if I could tell you that you could provide education to them, or healthcare, or there was a disease that was moving quickly and you could get to them, and you could see where they moved day by day. So if you look at a paper map, you can't see where people are moving. They're pretty fixed. If you look at digital traces, look at that pink area on a Friday, and on Saturday the pink people go to a market, and on Sunday they go back. The world is not only not constrained by national borders or lines drawn on paper, but it also is not a static world. It's a world of motility. What else has motility and mobility? Economies do, if they're designed right. So this starts to make us question, what would the world look like if we could start to design new economies and start to actually use the data about how people are interacting to design those economies rather than build them top down? I don't know. It's an interesting question. So in order to design economies that actually fit the needs of people, we would need to be able to see people who we can't see right now. Here's another country, also a country because it has straight lines. Here's Mauritania. If I said to you, where are all of the people in Mauritania? Where are all of the schools? You probably would say they're not in that desert area, the light yellow area. If I said to you, I've got 1 gigabyte of information that I could deliver to a kid, and that could totally optimize their access to information for a moment, and I said, where is that child? I could deliver that gig. Where would I put it? You probably wouldn't be able to tell me. You'd say it's in the dark area, not in the desert. Let's look at Mauritania through data for a second. This is Mauritania as seen through a complex layering of data with some very fancy machine learning run on top of it. This is Mauritania as seen through the data of network operators and satellites. The white triangles are cell towers. The dots are schools. Schools that are yellow on this picture are very connected. They've got Wi-Fi. You can be on WhatsApp in those schools. Schools that are blue have 2G. In those schools, you can send a text message or make a phone call, but you can't do more than that. The schools that are red in this picture have no connectivity at all. They're zero connected. And that's interesting when you look at Mauritania through the map of connectivity, because you suddenly see poverty. You see lack of equality, you see lack of access, you see volatility, because where those places collide, you have violence. Where the red areas are, where there's no connectivity, that's where a disease moves. If there's an outbreak that's spreading, it spreads through places where people can't talk to each other. But there's also business here, because if you're a phone operator, if you're providing bandwidth, those red areas are exactly where you can focus to get your next billion customers. And that's interesting because we didn't have that data before. And so just a ray of hope in terms of how we're using this, and then I'll come back to a little bit of where we see the future going. But you can't do very much if people don't exist. And there are right now in the world about 30% of children who do not exist in a formal manner. They don't have a birth certificate. They don't have all of the, I think I've got like 5 different forms of ID. 4 of them are real in my wallet. They're all real. I'm kidding, I would never do that. Thanks for the one laugh there. I like it. Now we're getting past the depressing stuff. If you don't have an identification, you do not have access to formal systems. You can't get into a university. You can't get good health care. If you don't have an identity, you can't travel across those borders that were drawn in books. And also, if you don't have an identity, as these compounded issues affect us all more, as there are more disasters from climate change, you are most at risk. So what we saw in Indonesia and in Haiti is after the disasters struck in both those places, the first people who were trafficked, the first kids who were picked up and sold, were the kids who didn't have an identity, who didn't exist. And actually, the first airplanes that come into a disaster are not government planes or UN planes, military planes, they're child trafficking planes, because those networks are stronger and better than anything we've been able to create on the good side of the world. But in Uganda, we started looking at what would happen if you extend the network. So the statistics in Uganda are worse. It's the opposite. It's about 60% of kids in Uganda 10 years ago didn't have a birth certificate. And Uganda's at the edge of the network, or it was then. There wasn't a lot of connectivity. And where there was connectivity, it was 2G. So we tried to see, like, what could we build using the techniques that we all know about of, like, let's be fast, agile, fail, blah, blah, blah. What could we build in Uganda that could try to fix this problem? And how could we start to create identity in a place that wasn't not a node on the network at that point? We set up a system that used a basic mobile phone to start hashing up birth certificates and birth registrations that happened at the point of care and send them over SMS and resolve that on servers in the government and create an identity for people who were too far away from a formal system to have access to the birth certification process. So if you're a kid who's born to a poor mother, that mother doesn't want to take you, she's going to travel, she's going to spend a month's salary to go to a place where there's a guy with like glasses and a leather jacket, he's going to take a bribe from her, and maybe at the end of that, she has spent 2 months' salary and you've got a birth certificate, which doesn't mean very much to her because the future optional value of it is not well described. Like, it's very hard to hedge against that future thing if you're telling a poor mother who makes $1 a day to spend $50 to get your birth certificate. But in the last few years, we've actually been able to see the birth certification rates and identity rates in Uganda go up to about 70%. I think it's now at about 80%. Because we were able to build a system in a place that the network was going to, it wasn't there yet, and build it with users, and build it in a way that was humble and open, and working with the tech providers there, who at that point were the mobile network operators. So that's cool. And it shows us that we can use some of the approaches that we see in the space of venture capital, investing in technology, to solve some of those big problems which really do affect us all. I wanted to sort of end by proposing 2 things and asking for some help. One thing is that we do have a small VC fund in UNICEF. It's the first venture fund in the UN, and we make early stage investments in companies in developing and emerging economies. We do have a call for blockchain-related technology companies, and here we're looking for companies that we think are building fundamental layers of technology that don't exist yet. So companies that are building on public permissionless blockchains, companies that are working in the open source space, but companies that are trying to address problems like, how do you do distributed ledger when that ledger cannot connect to a network for a while? How do you do off-chain transactions? How do you work when people can't spend a lot of money for a transaction cost? And how do you start to build up capacity for this technology, as we just heard from Michael, in diverse groups? We've made some interesting investments already in South Africa in a company there that's using a combination of blockchains to track attendance at schools. But we think that there's a lot more that we can do. And we think that the community of people building the technology needs to be global and needs to be very different than the community of people who's built a lot of the technology before in order to solve those problems. So the first ask is to please see if you know people in your networks, groups who would want to connect to that, and we're happy to walk them through the funding and application process. I'll give the link to the website on the last slide. But we are investing in these kind of frontier or next stage technology efforts in markets that are quite interesting. So recent bets have been a VR, AR play in Turkey, the work in South Africa with monitoring schools, and then some drone and UAV work for delivery of vaccines in Malawi and Vanuatu. And then lastly, just to connect with us through your communities and through ours, we're hiring a product lead for our blockchain work, which will bring our our cryptographic team to about 4. It's an engineer, two engineers, a UX person, and a product lead. So also to keep in touch and help us as we go through the next 12 to 24 months, because we believe that this technology really can, if built correctly and humbly, help to fix the world. Thank you.